So, last time we left off with the Warring States period, out of which emerged the Han Dynasty. Now, prior to that, we had talked about how out of the Yellow River Valley here on the North China Plain, the ethnically Han Chinese people who are, when I talk about like the Chinese, there are something like 50 different ethno-linguistic groups in China, but these often account for fractions of a percent. There are a billion Chinese, 99% of them, something like that, are Han Chinese, and so that's largely what I'm talking about. It's not actually 99%, it's the overwhelming majority. So, we talked about how the Han state expanded, and how this was largely a patrimonial state, meaning that if I was the emperor, if I was the king, my son would follow me. I would have sort of my uncles and cousins and brothers if I had any running things. We would try and make strategic marriage alliances with powerful regional warlord type guys who would basically become vassals, who would serve our dynasty in exchange for the grant of their territory, me basically saying, look, I'm in charge, and I'm legitimating your claim to that land. You rule that land, it goes to your sons in perpetuity. All you have to do is pay loyalty to me, which usually would mean a levy of troops in time of war. But one of the themes that we see in Chinese historiography is this idea of virtue, creating a ruling dynasty, and then gradual degeneracy taking hold, and losing the mandate of heaven. We talked about how the mandate of heaven, it was you were thought to have it if you were ruling well, if things were going, we would know that you had it because we were winning wars, harvests were going great, everything was really calm and tranquil. But if we started losing battles, losing wars, if the crop failures happened, if there was flooding or torrential storms, it was seen as the dynasty having lost the mandate of heaven. Peasant uprisings might happen. Your vassals, your nobility, might rebel against you, and this would lead eventually to the creation of a new dynasty. And we walked through our first couple of dynasties here, and then we saw how the Shu dynasty resulted in this warring states period, which was not terribly uncommon. You have these local power holders, we say like warlords, but really what you should think of is like these were powerful nobles or provincial governors or generals who had legitimate authority within the old system, but the guy running things now is doing a terrible job, and why should he be in charge? I'll just be in charge. And so the thing is, when the mandate of heaven is lost, it doesn't say, and this is the guy who should come next. You have to prove it through consolidating power, through winning wars and building alliances. And so the Han Dynasty is what comes after that. And we talked about how still we're talking about a non-professionalized state. The professionalization of the bureaucracy, which was very, very important. We talked about this is a way of maintaining state continuity, because now you're no longer going to have your brother's cousin in charge of something just because. Now you're going to have a bunch of scholar officials who are going to run things. And that's where we left off here, and that's taking place during the Tang and the Song dynasties. So that's where we're going to pick up here. So, okay. The professionalization of the Chinese state. This occurs during the Tang and the Song dynasties. Now, since the reading for this week spends a considerable amount of time on this, as well as on Confucianism, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes, I'm not going to spend too much time going into the details of the imperial examinations that produced the scholar officials who staffed the Chinese civil service. Again, there's, I think, 2 questions on that on the first exam, but the chapter is not terribly long. Who's looked at the chapter? Who's looked at the chapter? You should definitely start flipping through the chapter, because it's not terribly long reading, and like I said, just take a chunk one day, a chunk the next day, all done for the week. The chapters are very short. I think 1 or 2 of them are fairly long. Those come toward the end of the book, where they're just trying to cram a bunch of stuff in. So, I do want to say a few things about them just to call your attention to them. You may pick up whatever extra details you want. These civil service exams begin in approximately the 6th century under the Shui dynasty, but they really take hold under the Tang dynasty, which follows, and they're expanded under the Song. Now, generally speaking, these exams are meritocratic. That is, they were open to anyone regardless of their birth, and their purpose was to undermine the military aristocratic dominance by creating a single, unified, literate, administrative class whose loyalty was to the state, rather than to any other group or individual. They were incredibly successful, and they continued with only a few slight interruptions until the early 20th century. So that is, frankly, very incredible. This is over 1,000 years of continuity here. While there were different levels of examination, from the local to the palatial, and they had different emphases, they primarily consisted of the Confucian classics, which we'll be talking about on the next slide. I do just want to say one thing about the meritocratic elements of this. Yes, they were in theory open to anyone. However, you needed to be schooled in the Confucian classics, which meant you needed an education, you needed to be literate. And we are talking about a time when 99.9% of us probably were farmers and illiterate. So usually it was the sons of the nobility or the minor gentry or the commercial class who wound up getting these jobs. But that is to say, but it is a step in the right direction, I suppose. Moving away from just staffing it because he's your brother's son or something like that. So now, in part because of the stability that this more effective state administration brings, China becomes a center of learning, innovation, and wealth. This, combined with its relatively flat northerly geography, it's just plains, just wide open plains up there, made it a prime invasion target. However, invaders like the Mongols, and if you remember back to our earlier one, the Mongol Empire, who can see my cursor up there? Can you see that? Mm-hmm. Yes. So we have Mongolia right up here. This is where they're coming from, and they're coming down into the North China Plains. So that's it. So when we look at, I think I have a picture on here of the Great Walls, that most of them face in this direction. So this is where the invaders were coming from. So that's where the invaders always come from when we're talking about Chinese history. However, invaders like the Mongols, who would establish the Yuan dynasty, part of the great spreading Mongol Empire that I just showed you, these roving bandits found themselves needing to rely on the same class of Confucian Han Chinese scholar officials to extract all that wealth in China effectively. So this is an important point here. China is huge, right? China is huge. It's not like we talked about early state formation and the idea of stationary bandits, right? They show up to this one town, and these invaders say, hey, listen, we'll be kind of your muscle here. We'll be your military dictatorship, sort of. But we won't do anything to you. We'll protect you in exchange for wealth. Okay, well, China is huge. Even if you have a large army, it doesn't matter. You couldn't disperse one guy per square mile. It's simply too big. So you need to capture the capital and then get the bureaucracy, the far-flung bureaucracy that's all over the country, to start sending the money your way. And so what we have here is this process called Sinicization. That is, these invaders will essentially adopt Chinese culture themselves. So instead of imposing their own culture when they invade and conquer the area that is China, they will be kind of reverse assimilated. So instead of putting their own culture on them, they essentially just adopt Chinese culture. So there's always going to be a little bit of cultural interplay. For example, like the pigtail with the shaved head in front that you see in like a lot of movies and stuff like that. That was actually like not originally Han Chinese. That was like a Mongol thing. But. Okay, so now the last dynasty that you see listed on here is the Ming Dynasty. The Ming Dynasty. So if you're going to write down anything about the series of dynasties that ruled China, I would make it this. So you have the Mongol Yuan dynasty, okay? You have the Mongol Yuan dynasty. This was one of those dynasties that came down from the north, that were supplanted by the Han Chinese Ming dynasty. who were then supplanted by the Manchu Qing dynasty, who we will spend a lot of time talking about. Remember, we're just trying to get us up to 1500, so we will spend a lot of time talking about the Qing dynasty, because they're the ones who are going to be with us when the British and French and German and American imperial powers start getting involved in China in a big way in the 19th century. So remember, we're just trying to bring all these various places of the globe up to the 1500s so we can start joining these narratives together. So we have the Ming dynasty is the one that's going to be in place. It's the last ethnically Han Chinese dynasty. So the Great Dynasty before that, the Yuan dynasty, had been a dynasty of northern invaders who adopted Chinese culture and language. They are eventually thrown off by the Ming dynasty in a long series of wars, and then they are ultimately supplanted by another northern invasion by the Manchus, and they're the ones who are going to be actually ruling China. And this is going to be important because the ethnically Han Chinese resent the foreign occupation, right? These are foreigners. Like, yes, they are adopting modes of Chinese administration and modes of dress, but they are not ethnically Han Chinese. And so when the imperial powers arrive in the 19th century and start nibbling away at bits of China and undermining the authority of the Qing, there's no real strong sense of loyalty on the part of the mass population. And so as soon as the Qing start to appear weak, the 19th century is going to be a very bad century for China. Rebellions, civil wars, all of this is going to start happening. The greatest loss of life, actually, in the 19th century is going to happen in China. It's called the Taiping Rebellion. I mean, millions of people are going to get killed. So it's pretty horrifying. We'll definitely talk about it. But just so you know, that's why this is important to understand. There are ethnically Han Chinese dynasties, and the last ethnically Han Chinese dynasty is the Ming dynasty. That is on, I think, your first quiz. No, your first quiz, your first exam, and your final exam. So I'm going to ask you, what was the last ethnically Han Chinese dynasty? It's the Ming. It's the Ming. So, yeah. Yes, and it's the Qing dynasty that's going to supplant them, and the Qing dynasty will be with us all the way to the Republican Revolution in 1911, 1912, which will mark the jumping off point for talking about the beginnings of modern China, which will unfold over a series of decades and civil war and Japanese invasion. So, there you go. If you're ever asked, which you will be for the quiz, what was the last ethnically Han Chinese imperial dynasty, you will answer the Ming. And fun fact for you, the Triads, who's heard of the Triads? No? The Triads? Oh, they're like, like the Chinese mafia, right? Like their criminal organization. They actually had their origins as a secret society dedicated to the overthrow of the Qing and the reinstitution of the Ming dynasty. So it started as a secret society, and we're going to encounter a lot of these like secret conspiratorial societies who have these sorts of agendas. So that's interesting. So, okay. On this, which I believe is the final slide that I had for this particular one, you have the Great Wall, which is really the Great Walls. Yep, which is really the Great Walls. There are several stretches of walls. They were begun at multiple points and by different dynasties in order to confront different perceived threats. The first section of the wall dates back to the 7th century, but most of the really famous sections that you would see today, if you were sightseeing, for example, were built by the Ming. Perhaps, as I mentioned, maybe unsurprising given what we've just been talking about, most of the sections are facing north. Next up is cont, or Confucius, as we call him. The authors of your book, Aloso and Wilford, spend the preponderance of their time actually talking about Confucius and Confucianism in their chapter on China. So I'm going to let them do that. I'll just add a few things here to what you'll be reading over the next day or two. First is that despite the presence of Taoism, Buddhism, and later Islam, especially in the west of the country. And despite the fact that ideologically, Confucianism is probably closer to a philosophy than a religion in the Western sense, for our purposes, it is safe to say that Confucianism was the most dominant religion in China throughout the imperial period. That is also a quiz question. Indeed, even today, just recently, the Chinese Communist Party, who have ruled the country since the end of the 1940s, introduced a series of videos depicting Karl Marx and Confucius meeting and sharing ideas. They get along splendidly in China. The other thing you might want to note, because the authors don't make this entirely clear when they cite it, is that the Analects of Confucius are a series of aphorisms, sayings, later attributed to Confucius, and that Confucius himself is said to have simply been preserving a set of older classical texts by spreading their teaching. So that is not a test question. It is just it's something that we see quite often in the classical world. Is that you have people quite like Socrates. Socrates didn't write anything. You had Plato then later writing about him, attributing things to him. Other than that, Aloso and Williford do a very fine job as far as an introduction to the cardinal principles and virtues around which Confucianism is based. So, bottom left here, while we're talking about Chinese culture, I'll come back to sinicization and inventions in the Silk Road in just a second. Sun Tzu, attributed author of the military text, The Art of War, copies of which are still in virtually every major bookstore today. Thought to have been written somewhere in the 6th or 7th century BCE. Many of the aphorisms the book contains are applicable to the present day. One of my favorites is, the greatest victory is that which requires no battle. A formulation he repeats in several different ways throughout. And the idea here is that war is costly, both in lives and money, and more oftentimes has very destabilizing effects on a regime. And so the wise ruler seeks to win before the fighting even commences. Think of it as sort of like a warfare by prior position, like a war of position, right? Who's played the game Go? You've all heard of chess, right? Play chess? Anybody play chess? Yeah. You ever played Go? Okay, you should check it out, especially if you like chess. It is a similar game, but instead of attrition, you are seeking to occupy strategic places on the board. And there are actually many more variations and outcomes that you can have in Go versus chess. So it's interesting stuff. But anyway, and that comes from China, by the way. Chess, coincidentally, comes from India. Just fun fact. So, another classic text, which is relevant today. It was one of Mao Zedong, Mao's personal favorite. Mao Zedong. Have you guys heard of Mao Zedong? They mentioned him in like your high school history class. Okay, so Mao Zedong was one of the early Chinese communists. He eventually seizes full control of the party. They defeat the Japanese in the 1930s and 1940s in a civil war, or in a war on. He defeats rival Chinese who eventually flee to Taiwan and set up the Republic of Taiwan there, and then they also defeat the Japanese. And he rules China until 1977, I believe. The Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution. So Mao Zedong, Little Red Book. Okay, well, that's who it is. Mao Zedong. He's basically considered the founder of modern China. It was one of his favorites. This book. It's called The Romance of the Three Kingdoms. And in fact, Xi Jinping. Have you guys heard of Xi Jinping, the current leader of China? Okay, this is a text that he references too. Chinese history goes back a very long way, And if you listen to their speeches and different things like that, they very often will reference things that happened 1,000 years ago. Like they have a lot of key relevance to today. And so it's something very interesting. It's called The Romance of the Three Kings. You can get a copy of it on Amazon, translation in English for $10. It's cool. It's like a historical novel. It's about the years of the late Han Dynasty, but it was written during the Ming Dynasty. In that case, it's a lot like Mallory's L'Amour d'Arthur, The Death of Arthur, in that they're trying to tie together a series of existing, mostly oral history stories about the period. It's kind of a way of creating a shared set of stories that the culture can have and share together, much like the Brothers Grimm, the stories of the Brothers Grimm. Are you familiar with those, like the fairy tales? Yeah, those were actually a huge catalyst for German state building, because it was a way to spread a standardized version of the German language and a set of shared stories that even if you were from Bavaria or Saxony or Württemberg or whatever, you all knew these same stories. This was occurring in the context of the transition from the Mongol Yuan dynasty to the Han Ming dynasty, the last and greatest of the Han Chinese empires. And so the popularity of this retelling of ethnic Han Chinese heroism was fairly understandable. So, Sinicization. I already touched on this a little bit. Sinicization is just a word for saying that when invaders came to China, they found very quickly that they were not going to be able to extract the full amount of wealth that they could. Sure, they could show up at the imperial palace and smash and grab some stuff and carry it back to wherever they had come from. But it'd be way better, like I said earlier, to just set up shop and just be like the permanent, have the ability to permanently extract these resources. It's much safer, it's much more effective, but you need buy-in from the existing administration. You have all these far-flung networks of tax collectors, regulators. Think about it. If you want, zoom back. I'll use this one just because it's a big map. Obviously, this is France, but like if you're up here and you're the king of France and you want to send a message down here to the Duchy of Gascony, the fastest you're going to be able to get it there, right, is the guy on the horse, and he's going to have to ride there. Maybe he gets killed on the way. Maybe something happens. He never gets there, right? But it's going to take many, many months to get down there, many, many months to get back. And then how are you going to check up and make sure that this is actually getting done? What if there's resistance? You're going to send the army down there? That costs a lot of money. It's very destructive, destabilizing, because as your army is walking through the countryside, they're terrorizing the locals and stealing their stuff, and there's just not really a lot you can do about that. So it's going to make you very unpopular. So you want to tread as lightly as possible. And again, the easiest way to do that is, you have these very comfy bureaucrats who are in these positions of power. They don't really want to see the country, the state, fall into civil war, a period of warring states where there's lots of death and destruction and everyone is getting poorer and less secure. They'd like things to basically stay the same, right? Peace and unity and prosperity and commerce. China, during this time, China all the way up until about the year 1800 is easily the most wealthy, most advanced civilizational entity on Earth, despite periods of warfare, which destroy wealth and make you poorer. So as long as they are willing to basically adopt the way that the state is already being run, so instead of coming in and saying, we're going to make all these new rules and regulations and we're going to tell you what to do, as long as you just come in and say basically, all right, basically the way you guys are running things is fine. Now you just make the checks out to us, though. We'll be at the palace or whatever. That's all fine and good, and that is what happens. So, and of course, this is a generalization. As I said, there was oftentimes some degree of cultural interchange there. So, and it's very similar. There was a case like this in Europe as well. Is European history more familiar to you guys than East Asian history? Not particularly? Okay, well, there were like these Viking dudes who came from Scandinavia, and they were called Normans, and they'd do the same thing. They'd land on your coast and basically be like, hey, you guys are doing really well here. You know, if you need some muscle, we'll just adopt your religion and your language and stuff, you know, marry some of your daughters, and that's how we got like the Italo-Normans who lead the First Crusade, Bohemond, Count of Otranto, but yeah, so. Finally, we have the Silk Road and Chinese innovations. So let's start with the latter. The Chinese were the first to invent many of what would later become the most important technological advances of the modern period. Things like gunpowder, the magnetic compass, movable type. The Chinese were also the largest producers of silk, and they were the only producers of silk, which was highly sought after, until, around like, I think it was like 800, a pair of monks managed to smuggle some silkworms out of China for one of the Byzantine emperors. On the topic of Byzantium, the last picture that you see there, I forgot to replace my laser pointer. Got to write a note about that. There's Byzantium. I'm writing myself a note right now to replace that. So I have lots more PowerPoints and slides as we go along. Laser. Byzantium, that was the terminus of the Silk Road. So you have all the wealth and interesting goods, things like porcelain, glassware, silk, spices, all of these great things that you can't get in Europe, can't grow them, can't get them. You have to get them overland, right? You have to get them overland. And it terminated at the entrepot, the port, in what's today, I'm drawing a forward blank here. I'm sorry, Istanbul. It's Constantinople at the time. It's a large port city. And you would have Italian merchants from the maritime empires of the Genoese and the Venetians, most of the Venetians, coming over here. They would load up the stuff, take it back to Europe. This is why the Italian city-states were actually the wealthiest and most powerful and most advanced places in Europe. It's why that's where the Renaissance occurs. Of course, we talked about Constantinople is conquered in 1453 by the Ottoman Turks, and this is going to be one of the catalysts that causes the Iberian monarchs and explorers to start looking for ways to get over to China by way of water rather than the overland route, because overland route is very expensive. We talked about how difficult and expensive it is to get things overland, and really, gosh, it's so much easier if you can just take it over the water. Well, this is going to lead to a lot of innovation because you need to construct much stronger ships. You need to be able to navigate by using things like the stars and whatnot. That's why you see things like the astrolabe, which was actually brought from the Middle East into Europe, and they use these things to do that. So, one thing that is very curious, and I'm going to switch maps here real quick. Okay, so I'm sorry. So here we have China, right here. China, very advanced, the most advanced, I said. And we're nearing 1500 here. We're right in the 1500s area. We're talking about 1453. The Ming Dynasty is leading the way in all these innovations. Why didn't they start going out and colonizing and settling and all of those different things, right? This is a question that a lot of historians have asked. Why did this happen? So, the Ming are very interesting in this regard. One of the things is that China was constantly very busy defending its frontiers. It has many, many frontiers. It's something about the modern Chinese state today. it is surrounded by potentially hostile neighbors, and this requires the deployment of resources to monitor these things. And these are all resources that can't be put into naval resources. So there was one dynasty, and this was the Ming, who were very singular in that they pursued a period of deep water naval expeditions. Featured an incredible period of shipbuilding and travel around the Indian Ocean and South and East China Seas. You have voyages by this admiral, Zheng He, and there was incredible range on these voyages. They reach all the way to places like the eastern coast of Africa, what is today Somalia. So I'm actually going to pull it up. Yeah. Do you guys know where Somalia is? Do you guys know where the Horn of Africa is? Okay, so that's like an incredible distance. I mean, you're going all the way. Oh, here you go. You're going all the way over here, and then you stop all the way in between it. So for a period of several decades, the Chinese are conducting a very vibrant trade here. These voyages resulted in an expansive Chinese tributary system, with emissaries being brought back to the imperial court. This political network was very loose. It was not like the later colonial projects of the Western Europeans that we'll begin looking at a week after next. This is to say they were not highly militarized, and that these travelers, keep doing that. This is not to say that these were not highly militarized, right? You are living on one of these small islands, and this ship full of heavily armed, sophisticated dudes pour out of it. Like, there is an element of threat to it, right? Or that these travelers to the imperial court were always voluntary, far from it. But the Chinese were bringing things with them like silk, porcelain, etc. So they were in many cases welcome. And in any case, this foray into overseas expansion was not to last. The voyages ended in 1433 and never resumed. So it's very curious. You have this period of really intense, rapid naval expansion. This all happens in a couple of decades here. At a time when Europe is still very divided, very poor, very backwards, and right as European naval exploration is about to take off, the Chinese stop. And so it's just one of those interesting junctures of history where we could imagine very different things occurring. And that's one of the things that I think is interesting about history, is imagining how things could have gone different, just playing counterfactuals. So why did the Chinese stop? Why didn't they start going further onto the globe? They've uncovered some things that show these ships were huge. Several times the size of Columbus's vessels. They had a large fleet, plenty of resources. Why didn't they start traversing the globe, setting up colonies, converting the native populations to Confucianism? Well, the fact is no one is entirely sure. There are several theories, and the combination of various reasons scholars give no doubt get near enough to the truth for our purposes. First, floating such large fleets is extremely capital intensive, very expensive. And it isn't as though the Chinese financial system was very sophisticated by today's standards. There weren't a lot of liquid capital markets to float bonds and do different things like that. Nor was tax collecting very efficient. Even though you do have these scholar officials and this network of tax collectors, it's still very rudimentary by today. It's not like you have automatic withholding where the IRS is just sucking that money out automatically every time, right? You show up, the tax collector shows up, and the farmer goes, bad harvest, don't have the money. Well, you write down that you didn't have the money, and you come back. What are you going to do, right? Tax avoidance, then as now, is very common, right? It just couldn't. So there were fiscal causes for them stopping. Then there's a contemporary Chinese scholar who makes a very convincing case that the abandonment of the voyages was to a significant degree determined by bureaucratic infighting. That is, there were basically fights between different departments of the government. A good example of this, if you want to kind of picture our own present day, just imagine that the Navy and Air Force are fighting because one of them wants a new fleet of destroyers and the other one wants more money for fifth generation fighters, right? Like the government has so much money and you have different departments inside the government fighting over these resources. And the idea here is that Those who wanted naval expansion within the Chinese state lost out to those who wanted to put the money elsewhere, into more land forces, for example. And I actually think that this is borne out to some degree by what happens next, because there's danger on the frontiers, and they need to shift resources to meet these threats. Because while the threat environment to the south is very, very benign, you have lots of small, disconnected little ethnicities. It's very jungly down there. There's lots of small islands, etc. No real danger there. To the north, you have an invasion on the way. They're going to be invaded yet again from the north, and it's going to be the Manchus, who are actually, eventually, over the course of, I believe this war lasts like 60 years. It's a series of on-running wars, but eventually the Manchus are going to drive the Ming off of the Chinese mainland, and they're going to establish that final dynasty that we talked about, the Qing, who are going to be with us all the way to the 20th century. So they'll be with us for most of our class. So, you have pressing security needs to the north. A decade after the fleet is abandoned, the Ming will fight a series of engagements with the Mongols, and then those internal problems will pop up. There are rebellions. An invasion comes from the north, and the fighting's not going so well, and so rebellions pop up, and the treasure fleets. Another thing is the treasure fleets weren't really bringing back a lot of things that they needed, so it's hard to justify when you've got rebellions popping up, invasions to the north, and you're saying, hey, we should do some more treasure fleets and stuff, sail around some more. It's like, are you kidding me? It's not bringing back anything useful. We need these resources elsewhere. It's hard to kind of put yourself in this position and be like, these are just ordinary people, no different than us, and so the politics and policy discussions are going to be very much the same. It's possible they were turning a small profit, but they weren't bringing back necessities, and the resources were needed elsewhere. Remember, China is at its economic and technological peak of relative development here, that is compared to the rest of the world. And it is soon to be at its greatest territorial extent as well. But so it's urged to seek new products, new markets. It's just not that pressing. It wasn't creating client states either that you could use militarily against invaders like the Mongols or the Manchus. And lastly, this is something that Alosa and Williford are going to talk about in your textbook. The Chinese religion, Confucianism, was not evangelical. There was no drive to go out proselytizing, making converts. So, whatever the exact cause, I've just listed all the main reasons generally given. The fleets are abandoned, the Ming turn inward, and as I just mentioned, a little over a century later, they will be fully conquered by the invading Manchus. Well, this isn't really technically correct way to think about it, because the Qing were actually the descendants of the Jin, who were an earlier northern dynasty. So remember, there were 55 imperial dynasties. I couldn't mention them all, but basically this was one of the minor dynasties during the Warring States. So it was kind of their descendants. So, but there you go, the Qing. They were Manchus. So, okay. Yeah, this period. So it's actually kind of interesting. So basically, what it was here was they were the Qing, the Manchus were essentially like vassals of the Ming, and they felt like they were being treated poorly, right? And we talked about if you are not ruling justly, wisely, if there's corruption, misrule, you're said to have lost the mandate of heaven, and that this justifies rebellion. This is exactly what happens here. Is basically the Ming are presented with this series of grievances by these northern lords who are their vassals up there, and they're saying, hey, there's a lot of corruption, you're taxing us too much, take it easy. They issue these 7 grievances. They present this petition to the court, and the court just says, hey, get out of here with that. And so they start a military rebellion, and eventually they take over the country. So there you go. Kind of like a baron's revolt. Again, if you want to put it in the European context. So it takes decades for this to all sort itself out, for the Qing Empire to be established. 1683. Ironically, given how basically the Qing are going to drive the Ming off of the mainland, and they wind up on this little island called Formosa. Formosa. What is Formosa another name for? What do we call Formosa today? Taiwan. And so it's very interesting here. I don't know if there will be, yeah, I'll do a map of China. Asia. I just think this is very interesting, and so I'm going to pull it up here. Southeast Asia, there we go. Can you show me this right here? Yeah, there you go. So, basically, you have this dynasty that loses control, right? And they're driven off the mainland gradually in a slow process, pushed off the mainland, and they hole up on Taiwan, where they are for about 25 years until finally the Manchu create a fleet and go destroy them. In the 1940s, when Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese Republican nationalists lose out to Mao Zedong and the communists are invading from the north, they push them off the mainland and they wind up on Taiwan. So it's just kind of curious that 400 years ago this almost exact situation happened. So, and of course it's still unresolved to this day. Mainland China considers Taiwan an integral part of China. Taiwan wants to be, well, they don't want to be part of mainland China, let's just put it that way. So, it's complicated, but there you go. So, just a fun fact. Fun little bit of history there. Okay. Before moving on, just a couple of things to note. So again, I'm trying to situate us when we leave this lecture today at 1500 so we can leave China. Because what I want to do is I want to go into Central Asia, look at the Mughals, the Safavid, the various Indian kingdoms and dynasties. Want to move us over to the Ottomans, get us to Europe, the Americas. And so by this time in 2 weeks, we'll have every part of the globe at the starting line, and then we can join all these narratives together and stop talking about all these regional things that are going on and talk about one cohesive narrative. So, in the late Ming period, so this is after Columbus has sailed, right? They have granted the Portuguese trading rights on the island of Macau. So we're going to talk later about this in coming weeks when we get to these Iberian explorers. But this is sort of the first foothold there of European traders in China, because the Portuguese, they actually sail around Africa and go that way. So the Qing are going to carry on many wars of conquest. I said that after the displacement of the Ming, the Chinese state is going to reach its greatest territorial extent. And this is what is going to happen under the Qing. It expands all the way into Central Asia, gobbling up areas that, to this day, are somewhat problematic for the regime in Beijing. So do any of you follow the news? The Uyghurs? You ever heard of the Uyghurs? Yes. So that's where they are, right? They're not ethnically Han Chinese people in this area. They've expanded into Central Asia at this point. So this was the Manchus who did this. So this was not a part of the traditional Chinese lands. This was an area that had generally been part of, if you want to think of China's sphere of influence, sort of. There was no other major civilizational entity right there. You do have caliphates over here, but that's further into Central Asia there. So the Manchus, they're going to extend the Chinese polity to its greatest territorial extent. They're going to push deep into Central Asia in a series of campaigns during the middle of the 18th century, that is the 1700s. So, right, the American Revolution has not happened yet, right? We're about 50 years from the American Revolution happening, the 13 colonies, and China is at this point reaching its greatest territorial extent. This is the apogee of Chinese imperial power. The Manchu dynasty, though, begins encountering a series of very serious problems around this time, both internal and external. And these problems are only going to get worse. You have European traders who are arriving in ever greater numbers, and they're bringing all sorts of destabilizing things with them. Things like drugs, opium. Yes?
In the Qing Empire, was it ran by like traditional, like ethnically Chinese people, or like people?
Yes. Oh, yes. Again, the scholar bureaucratic officials who actually administered the empire, they were ethnically Han Chinese.
Oh.
You did have military leadership who were, Manchu, but the actual running of the empire was left to the scholar official elite. Not that you couldn't have an outsider get into that, but it would be very difficult to do that because you would need an incredible amount of education at a time still when, maybe 2% of the population is even literate.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's a good question.
I felt like the Chinese were trying to preserve their culture so much they didn't want to take over other lands and like other people. Because, even when the Mongols came in, they obviously got other cultures, so that's why they were trying to just not take over land and have mountains and everything between them and other countries. They just kept that flat land there.
Well, I think in this case what we have is the Manchu were not ethnically Han Chinese, right?
Yeah.
And so their military culture was one of warfare and expansion. So it's true, and there were a lot of difficulties, a lot of clashes there, because there were, we talk, and this is a 100 level course, so a lot of times I say this state did that, this state did this. There are factions within states and within bureaucracies who are fighting. So some parts of the government wanted to try and sinicize these new conquered peoples. These Turco-Muslim peoples. Others were like, no, that's just going to cause lots of problems and resistance, and so it's better to just leave them to have cultural autonomy, and as long as they keep quiet and pay their taxes, that should be just fine. And that's actually a policy debate that happened within the modern Chinese state when when China went through its period of civil wars in the 1930s, and then its war with Japan in the 1930s and 1940s, parts of China basically kind of started flying off, and eventually the communists had to go in with the People's Liberation Army and reconquer all these territories. There were all these there was an independent Uyghur republic for I think 2 years or something like that. But then they had to have these policy debates all over again. And so, for example, you're familiar with China's one child policy. Have you heard of that? China's one child policy? Okay, well, the Uyghurs, the Turco-Muslim populations there, were exempted from that. They were exempted from that. And it's one of the reasons that the Chinese state in the last 10 or 15 years has tried to engage in population control in these areas, because they were having tons and tons of children, and it was creating a demographic problem for the Chinese state. And so they tried to go in there and say, look, you guys gotta stop having so many children. One child, basically trying to apply the one-child policy to these areas. So, yeah. So it's interesting. Yeah. Okay. Oh, we're about to leave China. Yes, we're about to leave China, but I will just say, so they're bringing drugs, opium. They're running that in from India. It's going to be terribly, terribly harmful. And this is what's going to actually, when we meet China again later, it's going to be in the context of what were called the Opium Wars. Basically, the British Empire is going to fight to open China up to the legal flow of large amounts of opium. The imperial government is trying to keep it out. And so it's kind of ironic because, of course, today one of the big things in the news is what? What's China flooding the country with? Fentanyl, right? So it's just kind of ironic because, foreign religions, Christianity. The history of Christianity in China is interested and variegated, though hardly central prior to the 19th century. I will talk about that more. But Christianity was seen as very, very destabilizing to the regime. And actually, the Taiping Rebellion that I mentioned earlier, the leader of the Taiping Rebellion is a fellow who was proselytized by missionaries and came to believe that he was the brother of Jesus. and he leads this rebellion. So, yeah, okay. So we're going to leave China here at present at the zenith of its power. Seems like a very nice thing to do. As I said, the next time we introduce China to the narrative, picking up right here at the beginning of the 19th century, so I'm going to leave China right here in the year 18. Okay. Jot that one. So we're going to leave China in the year 1800. Qing dynasty, and at greatest territorial extent. As I said, this expansion has caused problems. It stretches resources. It makes it less easy to maintain control over parts of the country that you've already conquered. There's going to be lots of rebellions. Remember, these are foreigners. These are foreigners. And many ethnically Han Chinese resent them and don't want to be ruled by them. Okay. So, I'm just going to very quickly, with what little time I have left, introduce you to where we are going to be going next. And we are following here Aloso and Williford. I'll pull the book up here. It's a beautiful book. Stuff right here. And this is that cool map that I had mentioned that you can see. This is the expansion of the Mongol Empire. And yeah, it's just pretty incredible. I mean, in 100 years, they go blasting out of the plains of Mongolia. They reach all the way to the Hungarian plains in Europe, right here. And then it quickly fractures. And then it quickly fractures. We talked about that element of rapid imperial expansion there, is then they feud among themselves. This piece of the empire right here is eventually going to establish the Mughal Empire in India, which we're going to meet Tuesday. So, I'm going to bring this down here. These are the ships right here. This was Zheng He's flagship right here, and it is compared to the ship used by Columbus. I mean, so again, it's interesting to think about, like, what if the Chinese had just kept going? It's like they clearly had the sea-going capabilities to hit the oceans. Part of it might have been obviously they didn't know how big the Pacific Ocean was, but obviously you guys are aware that crossing the Pacific Ocean and crossing the Atlantic Ocean are not even close to the same thing, right? Like, flown over the Atlantic Ocean many times, and even I'm kind of like, oh, the Pacific Ocean? Dang, man, I don't know. Pretty big. Lots of planes get lost out there. It's a big area. So, okay. All right, and here we go. These are the voyages. I love the book. You guys should really check out the book. These are all of Zheng He's voyages. As you can see, we get all the way to the Horn of Africa. They're going to appear into the Gulf Bays. Very cool stuff. And it's showing the Ming Empire here with all of its various neighbors here. Japan, the Persian Korean Kingdom. Here are your Mongols up here. This is the Khanes. This is one of the leftovers of the Great Mongol Empire here. Yeah, they make it all of them. So, lots of stuff on Confucius down here, lots of his aphorisms, and there you go. That is chapter 1. That is the Chinese state. That is what you will see on the quiz. Now, when we get to here, you're going to want to scroll down for your reading for next week. I'm just prepping you this. You're going to want to go down here, and you're going to want to start with the Safavids, right here, Safavids, and the Ottomans. Don't do the Europeans. So just skip the first paragraph, the first page of stuff here, like this stuff right here. Oops. Whoa. Okay. Right here. Just skip this first little bit of stuff about Europe. I'm going to tackle Europe itself. We are basically starting in China. There's China over here. We're starting in China in the east, and we're moving westward. So we're going to hit the Safavids and India and the Ottomans, and then we'll go to Europe, and then we'll head with Europe over to the Americas. And there will be a quick little part of the Tuesday after next, so a week from Tuesday, that the first part of that lecture will just be saying what civilizations had grown up in the Americas that Columbus and Cortez and Pizarro are encountering in the year 1500. And from there, it's actually a very easy process of explaining how the race for colonies tied the globe together and created that one cohesive narrative that will eventually culminate in things like World War I. So the Safavids and the Ottomans for next week. And then yes, so there's not a ton of reading for next week. It's very dense. It's very dense material there. I recommend reading it very thoroughly. But yeah, so any questions? Any questions about this awesome book? I love this. It's a really solid book and it's free. It's free. You guys know textbooks are such a racket, right? That's what we did. They're like level 100 math book and stuff, but everything they need is like over $200. Outrageous. So I like to save you guys money like that. There you go, open source. Okay, the quiz. I'm gonna open it right now. I know what to do. I made one simple mistake when I was setting it up on Brightspace. I'm opening it right now. It is, I believe it closes at 11:59 on Monday. Again, I would recommend read the question, flip through the text, pull the answer out. Grab those points. All right, if you need me over the weekend, please email me. I check my emails. I have many emails. I check them all the time. So if you email me, you will hear back from me straight away, unless I fell asleep. I have 5 kids, so sometimes I just fall asleep right now. Very sad. Okay, quizzes, here we go. Sorry about that, guys. It is now available.
Sure. Let me just stop recording real quick. Yep.